The fluorescent lights of the Metropolitan Police firing range hummed a monotonous electric tune overhead, a sound that always seemed to amplify the silence between gunshots. For the dozen or so officers undergoing their quarterly proficiency training, the range was a place of focused concentration. But for one man, it was a stage for a very public humiliation. His name was David. He stood at the end of Lane 7, a new recruit to the Royal Protection Detail, a role that was the pinnacle of a police career. He was tall but carried himself with a slight stoop, as if trying to take up less space. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirrored shine. But it was the nervous tremor in his hands as he loaded his standard-issue Glock 17 that drew the smirks. "All right, lads, let's see what the palace has sent us," bellowed the range master, a barrel-chested man named Sergeant Finch, whose voice could strip paint. His words were met with a ripple of laughter from the other officers, seasoned men from armed response units who viewed the Royal Protection Team as little more than well-dressed doormen. David kept his eyes on the target, a menacing silhouette 30 meters downrange. The command came. "Shooters, ready! Target, 1 round, commence!" A rapid crackle of gunfire erupted. David raised his weapon. He took a breath, let half of it out, and his finger, which had trembled moments before, became an extension of his will. He squeezed the trigger with a slow, deliberate precision that was at odds with his anxious demeanor. Crack. The sound was lost in the fusillade. After the ceasefire, the targets trundled back along the wire. Officers leaned in to inspect their handiwork. There were tight groups in the chest, a few errant shots in the shoulders. Finch walked the line, barking praise or criticism. He stopped at Lane 7. He squinted at David's target. A single hole was perfectly centered in the forehead of the silhouette. For a second, Finch was silent. Then he laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Bloody hell, Davies. You put one in its head. On a 5-meter target, that's a lucky shot. But this isn't the Wild West, and we're not trying to look cool. We're trying to stop a threat, not perform a lobotomy. Center mass, you idiot. The biggest part of the body." He jabbed a thick finger at the chest of his own target. "This is where you put rounds. Lots of them. Fast. You're on a protection team, not a fantasy sniper team. Let's see you try for the body this time, eh? If you can." The other officers snickered. One of them, a young constable with a cocky grin, leaned over. "Yeah, Dave, leave the fancy stuff to the movies. Just point and squeeze, mate. It's not that hard." David didn't react. He simply nodded, his face a mask of calm. He unloaded his magazine, his movements economical and practiced. No one noticed the way he handled the weapon, not with the clumsy grip of a novice, but with the quiet intimacy of a craftsman. The next round began. Rapid fire, 2 rounds to the body. The range erupted. David fired twice. On his target, 2 new holes appeared, less than an inch apart, directly over the silhouette's heart. His grouping was tighter than anyone else's on the line, but he had, once again, ignored the instruction. He had aimed for the chest. But not just the chest. He had aimed for the central nervous system, the fastest way to incapacitate a threat. It was muscle memory. Finch saw the tight, deadly group, and his face reddened. He saw it not as marksmanship, but as defiance. "Right. That's it," he snarled, marching over and snatching the Glock from David's hand. "You're done. You're a liability. You don't follow simple instructions. You think you're above this training? You're not. You're a Royal Guard. Your job is to stand there and look pretty. This," he said, waving the pistol, "is just a prop for you. Get out of my sight. Report to your supervisor. Tell him Finch said you need to be reevaluated. Maybe they'll put you back on gate duty where you belong." The silence in the range was absolute. Every officer was staring. David's face remained impassive, but a deep weariness settled in his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply took his ear protectors off, hung them on the hook, and walked the long, lonely walk past the rows of stalls, past the smirks and whispered comments. He felt the weight of their contempt, a familiar weight. He had felt it before, in different circumstances, in a different world. He was used to being underestimated. He preferred it that way. Part 2. The days following the range incident were a special kind of hell for David. He was relegated to static duties, standing for hours on end outside a minor royal's London residence, a glorified scarecrow in a bearskin hat. The other officers on the protection squad, who had heard the story from Finch's version of events, treated him with a mixture of pity and disdain. And they called him Dead-Eye Dave behind his back, a nickname laced with sarcasm. He was the punchline to a joke about policemen who couldn't handle their firearms. He spent his shifts in solitude, his mind drifting. He would stand at his post, his body rigid, but his thoughts were 1,000 miles away, in the scrubland of the Afghan desert or the humid jungles of Colombia. He was a ghost, haunting his own past. His flat, a sparse and impersonal space in a modern block, was his refuge. There were no photographs on the walls, no souvenirs from his travels. The only personal item was a small, worn, leather-bound book sitting on his nightstand. It wasn't a diary, but a collection of observations, wind speeds, barometric pressures, range estimations, hand-drawn diagrams of terrain. It was his personal Bible from another life, a life he never spoke of. Some nights, sleep was elusive. The silence of his flat was a stark contrast to the cacophony of memory. He would lie in bed, the hum of the city outside his window a poor substitute for the sounds that were seared into his brain. The thump of rotor blades, the crackle of a radio, the whispered confirmation of a successful shot. He had been one of the best, a ghost, a precision instrument. Now he was a joke. One afternoon, a face from that buried past materialized in the crowd outside the palace. David was on a routine walk-through, his eyes scanning the faces of tourists, a habit he couldn't break. Then he saw him, a man in a nondessuit, leaning against a lamppost, reading a newspaper. He was average in every way: height, build, hair color, the kind of person you'd never look at twice. But David looked twice. He saw the rigid posture, the way the man's eyes moved behind the newspaper, systematically cataloging the environment. He saw the faint scar tracing a line from his earlobe to his jaw. It was a face from a past operation, a face that belonged to a man who was supposed to be dead. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. No nod of recognition, no change in expression. The man simply folded his newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and melted into the crowd of tourists. David's heart didn't pound. It slowed, his training taking over. He filed the sighting away, his mind racing through a Rolodex of threats and potential targets in the city. There was an EU summit in 2 days. Several high-profile dignitaries would be in attendance. The man's presence was no coincidence. He was a scout. Back at the Protection Command Center, David tried to raise the alarm. He asked to speak to the intelligence liaison, a stiff bureaucrat who looked at David's file, the one that noted his recent range failure and subsequent disciplinary note, with obvious skepticism. David explained what he saw, describing the man in meticulous detail. He didn't mention the past operation, only that the man's behavior was tactically aware and that he was a person of interest. The liaison officer, a man named Caldwell, leaned back in his chair, a patronizing smile on his face. "Officer Davies, you're describing a tourist reading a newspaper. It's a common pastime in London, and your profile suggests you might be a little overzealous when it comes to threat assessment. Sergeant Finch's report indicates you have a problem following procedure. I think you're seeing shadows. My advice? Stick to your post and let the professionals handle intelligence. He dismissed David with a wave of his hand. David was dismissed, his warning ignored. He felt the familiar cold dread in his stomach. He was right. He knew he was right. The man was a ghost from his own shadow war, a loose end from a mission that had officially never happened. The professional intelligence officers were looking for chatter, for known terrorist cells, for the obvious. They weren't looking for a ghost. They couldn't see what David saw because they didn't know the language. They hadn't lived it. That night, David sat in his flat, the worn leather book open on his lap. He wasn't reading it. He was staring at the wall, calculating. He knew the summit route. He knew the vulnerable points, the buildings with lines of sight. And he began to think like his old self. If he were the man in the crowd, where would he set up? The question wasn't if he was a threat. The question was where and when, and he was the only one who could find the answer. Part 3. The morning of the EU summit dawned gray and blustery, a typical London day. The streets around the conference center were a hive of controlled chaos. Police barriers, sniffer dogs, and a heavy presence of uniformed officers. David was assigned to a peripheral cordon, a position miles from the action, a final humiliation designed to keep him as far from the dignitaries as possible. He stood with his back to a wall, watching the stream of official cars pass, a spectator at an event he was supposedly there to protect. He should have felt useless, sidelined. Instead, he felt a strange sense of clarity. And from his lowly position, he had a unique perspective. He could see the whole security apparatus as a civilian might, and therefore as an attacker might. He saw the gaps. The uniformed officers were focused on the obvious choke points. The counter-sniper teams were positioned on the roofs of the official buildings, their gazes locked on the procession route. But they were looking for a rifle, for the classic silhouette of a shooter. They weren't looking for a ghost. David's eyes were elsewhere. They scanned the older, less secure buildings that lined the periphery. Buildings that had been overlooked because they were deemed too far away for an accurate shot with a standard weapon. But David knew that too far was a relative term. He remembered shooting distances that would make these men gasp. He calculated angles, windage, and the effect of the gusting wind. His mind, honed by thousands of hours behind a scope, began to paint a picture. He saw it. A disused office block, maybe 1,200 meters from the main dais where the final group photo would be taken. It was in a state of disrepair, with a cluttered roof and windows that were boarded up. But on the top floor, one window was open just a crack. It wasn't an obvious vantage point. A standard sniper wouldn't choose it because of the difficult angle and the wind turbulence caused by the surrounding buildings. But a ghost would. A ghost would see the chaos of the wind as a friend, a variable they could master. David couldn't call it in. He had no credibility. Any alert from him would be ignored and might even tip off the man if the communication was intercepted. He had to move. He looked around. His immediate supervisor was distracted, arguing with a traffic warden. David made a decision that violated every protocol. He slipped away from his post, melting into a side alley. He was AWOL. He was risking his career, his pension, his freedom. But he wasn't a royal guard anymore. The mask was off. The ghost was back. He moved through back streets with a fluid grace that was at odds with his usual stoop. He wasn't David the ridiculed guard. He was the shadow he used to be. He approached the derelict office block from the rear. The fire escape was rusted but held his weight. He climbed silently, his senses on high alert. He didn't have a weapon. He was a policeman in a dress uniform, climbing towards a possible assassin with nothing but his bare hands and his training. On the top floor landing, he paused. He could hear it now, as a sound so faint it was barely there. The slow, rhythmic breathing of a man in a state of profound concentration. David peered around the corner. There he was, the man from the crowd. He was kneeling by the open window, his back to David. He wasn't using a large military-style sniper rifle. It was a custom-built weapon, broken down into a compact case that now lay open beside him. The rifle was assembled, its long, fluted barrel resting on a sandbag. The man was calm, his eye pressed to the scope, his finger hovering just outside the trigger guard. He was waiting for the moment the Prime Minister would step onto the dais. David moved. He didn't announce himself. There were no witty one-liners. He crossed the dusty floor in a silent rush. The man must have sensed a change in the air, a displacement. He started to turn, his hand reaching for the pistol holstered at his side, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. David's world narrowed to a single point of contact. His left hand clamped onto the man's gun hand, pinning it to his side, while his right forearm came across the man's throat in a vice-like chokehold. It was a technique of devastating efficiency, taught in a world far removed from a police firing range. There was no struggle. The man's body went rigid for a moment, then limp as the blood flow to his brain was cut off. David lowered him silently to the dusty floor. He stood there, his breath controlled, looking down at the unconscious assassin. The city hummed its ignorant tune 12 stories below. He had stopped a bullet no one else even knew was coming. He looked at the rifle in the scope. He could see the dais, perfectly framed. The Prime Minister was just stepping out of his car. David reached down and calmly ejected the round from the chamber. He then picked up the assassin's radio, listening to the frantic, confused chatter of the man's support team, who were waiting for a shot that would never come. Part 4. The aftermath was a blizzard of confusion. Armed response teams, alerted by a confused call about a possible intruder in the derelict building, stormed the top floor. They found David still in his Royal Guard uniform, standing over the bound and gagged form of the assassin. For a terrifying moment, guns were leveled at him. David simply raised his hands, slowly, and said, "He's the one you want. Check the rifle. Check his ID. And tell your commander to check the window ledge. There's a spotter in the building across the street. He'll be running. You have about 90 seconds. His calm, authoritative tone cut through the chaos. A sergeant, seeing the unconscious man and the high-tech rifle, made a split-second decision. He lowered his weapon. "Secure him!" he yelled, pointing at the assassin. He then looked at David, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" David didn't answer. He just looked towards the window. "The spotter. You're wasting time." They caught the spotter just as David had predicted, trying to slip away in the panicked crowd. Back at the command center, the atmosphere was electric with a different kind of tension. The initial instinct of the Metropolitan Police hierarchy was to bury the story. A Royal Guard had gone AWOL and single-handedly thwarted an assassination attempt. And it was a public relations nightmare that highlighted their own intelligence failure and a miracle all at once. They tried to frame it as a coordinated effort, a team success. But the truth, as it always does, began to leak out. Caldwell, the intelligence liaison who had dismissed David's warning, was conspicuously absent. Sergeant Finch was suddenly transferred to a rural station in Cornwall. The officers who had laughed at David on the firing range now couldn't meet his eye. The narrative was shifting, and it was shifting fast. Then the official inquiry began. It was led by a stern, no-nonsense woman from the Home Office. David sat before her in a plain suit, his face once again an unreadable mask. She had his personnel file, the one with the range report. She also had a sealed file, at one that had arrived from a very different government department, marked with classifications that made her assistant gulp. She looked from one file to the other, then back at David. "Officer Davies," she began, her voice softer than he expected. "The file before me from the Metropolitan Police paints a picture of a below-average officer with a disciplinary issue regarding firearms. The other file—" She paused, tapping the sealed envelope. "Suggests something else entirely. It suggests that for 10 years you were a member of the Special Air Service attached to a covert reconnaissance and sniper team. It lists operational theaters that I am not at liberty to discuss. It mentions decorations for valor that were never publicly awarded." She leaned forward. It says you were one of the most effective and accurate snipers the regiment has ever produced. A living ghost. Can you explain this discrepancy?" David was silent for a long moment. The room was still. He wasn't thinking about the question. He was thinking about the faces of the men he had served with, the ones who hadn't come back. He was thinking about the weight of a secret so heavy it had crushed his civilian life. He finally spoke, his voice quiet and even. "Ma'am, I joined the SAS because I wanted to serve my country in a way that mattered. When I left, I wanted a quiet life. I didn't want the attention. I didn't want the parades. I just wanted to be normal. I joined the police for the same reason I joined the army, to protect people. The range—" He paused, a flicker of something, not quite a smile, crossing his lips. "The range was a test of procedure, not of skill. I know how to stop a threat. I did it my way. I always have." The story couldn't be contained. The news of the Guardian Ghost, as the press dubbed him, exploded across the world. It was a fairy tale for a cynical age. The mocked officer, the humiliated guard, revealed to be a special forces legend. David was hailed as a hero. He was offered promotions, media deals, book contracts. He turned them all down. He did one thing. He requested a transfer. A few months later, he was assigned to a new role. He wasn't on the Royal Guard anymore, and he wasn't on a standard police cordon. He was an advisor, a quiet man in a suit, working with the Metropolitan Police's own counter-sniper teams. He would stand on firing ranges watching officers train. He wouldn't say much. But when he did, they listened. He taught them about wind and angles, about patience and the weight of a trigger. He taught them that the best shot is the one that is never fired. He had finally found a place where he could be both the man he was and the man he wanted to be. He was no longer a ghost. He was a guardian, once more. And this time, everyone knew it.